At the deepest level, opening up is clear in establishing that capitalism does not merely allocate resources because it reorders the relationship between state societies and future obligations within African context. And this type of reordering is uniquely destructive because the post-colonial states are still performing three roles simultaneously right now. Like one, they're nation builder. Two, they're also a distributor. And three, they're legitimacy producer. Like capitalism is structurally hostile to that triple function. And a lot of what PF says prove at best capital allocation. As what Joseph says, this is largely concentrated in richer states like South Africa and their three capitals, for example. The real question in this debate is not whether African countries could have private ownership under capitalism, but who controls the economy in practice and how power is distributed in the first place. On both sides of the debate, markets still exist and people still can own private property. This is not a debate about abolishing free markets or personal ownership. The real tipping point here is about who control key industries that shape life choices, specifically healthcare, education, and public works and infrastructure. Under negative, the sectors are still deliberately nationalized because they are not ordinary markets. They determine the access to health, skills, mobility, and opportunity that we have. Leaving them to profit-driven allocation entrenches the problem within inequality that they're facing right now, especially in societies that are already divided by history and wealth. Like state control ensures universal access, long-term planning, and protection from market failure that we want to avoid in the first place. Because coming from side government, capitalist prioritization, by contrast, treats the sectors as investment opportunities. So the problem with that is that if you're going to start with that growth, that leads to uneven provision right on the spot. That's why underinvestment in unprofitable regions and outcomes dictated by ability to pay rather than social need wouldn't really happen. So the divide is not free markets versus no markets. It is whether essential services are governed by public obligation or private incentive. On both sides, they can be bad leaders, and leadership quality is not exclusive to any economic system. The key difference is how much damage bad leaders are allowed to do in both sides of the house. Under Negative's model, leaders no longer exercise absolute unchecked control. They are constrained by African Socialist Party, institutional oversight that it carries in the first place. Wait, my timer. Okay, so institutional oversight that it carries in the first place and the collective decision-making structures that it has, coming from the policy from Joseph. This limits arbitrary policy wings and personal entrenchment and unilateral asset transfers that can happen in capitalism. Because by contrast, capitalist systems in weak institutional contexts, right, in North Africa, often amplify the harm of bad leaders by giving them their discretion over privatization, contracts, and regulatory capture, areas where decisions are difficult to reverse, and assets are transferred to private or foreign actors. So, the negative does not claim better leaders, it claims better safeguards in the first place against the bad ones. Because we can still buy it like, China used socialism first before they jump into capitalism. We can still all do that. The problem is, if we want to co-opt all of the benefit right now coming from side government, the problem is it's not applicable to the current political state of all African countries. Remember, and this is going to be my first push, capitalism requires political legitimacy. Africa needs political construction first, and capitalism is not the one that's going to bring that. Most African countries are not capitalist states in the sense that affirmative needs. There are political states with different selective markets, and pushing capitalist policies in this context does not create free market, but instead concentrates power within their union. For example, Rwanda's relative success is not evidence that capitalism works in Africa. It is evident that capitalism only works when paired with extraordinary ordinary political control, centralized authority, and long-term planning discipline. Features far closer to the development statism than free market capitalism. What Rwanda copied from Singapore, for example, was not capitalism, but it was managed by the type of management of LKY, where the markets operate under extreme political supervision. The problem is, it's not going to be applicable for every African governments. No, majority of African governments still building those institutions insofar as they're still fragile from all of the abuses that are happening right now in the status quo from China and US, for example, if they plan to transition. And that happened within these economies historically, even before the prior abuse that you have right now in the status quo. And prioritizing capitalism before that point weakens the state because this empowers elites in this continent, which heavily destabilizes societies upon it. That is the comparative that we have clearly entered, that capitalism is high risk, high reward, and it's going to be applicable to limited states only. Even in so-called capitalist African states, the economy is not driven by domestic competitive markets. It is driven by legacy multinational contracts with firms like Nestle, for example, extractive corporation and agricultural businesses giants and energy conglomerates that were negotiated under asymmetric power conditions, and these constructs already lock in ownership, pricing power, supply chains, and export orientation. When the affirmative says that push more capitalism, they're just pretending that liberalization frees African economies. But in reality, it just deepens the dependency on the same eminency structure, because new domestic capital from affirmative cannot realistically compete with entrenched foreign actors that already control infrastructure, logistics, and global market access within these countries. But sure, I'll take the POI.
Private companies
he
have
has been
competition
in
as
power
a
since
safeguard
ages, right?
against bad leadership.
Okay, I'll take the opening.
Private companies have competition as a safeguard against bad leadership and the removal of toxic government incentives, but there is no safeguard against socialist parties and their arbitrary nationalism and regulation.
Bro, literally, there is ASP who will literally regulate that, because it is one body for the entire continent. And the problem in capitalism is based on what I have spoken about earlier. Like, literally, it's easier for bad leaders to just opt in within this privatization, opt in within this MNC structure. And this is why the problem with expecting innovation and growth through the lens of capitalism is that we will always be a Western or European definition of growth, despite having this quote-unquote leaders. Especially, it's really prevalent in these areas to have bad political actors with bad faith incentive to cooperate with Western markets, forcing market force and expectation to be largely dictated by what they want, pillaging and extracting mining oil and extraction industries at their expense. They rather own stake in Africa rather than buying them on fair terms from African people. That is why more capitalism does not undo exploitation. It just legitimizes it. And the DPM's case is not exclusive. Adopting socialist or state-led policies does not prevent African governments or parties such as ASP from accessing international capital. They can still raise funds through sovereign bonds and external debt, just as China has done, while retaining strong state control over strategic sectors within Africa. The key distinction is not whether funding is available, but who controls the terms and downstream the distribution of that capital. A state-led system can accept foreign financing without surrendering ownership, policy autonomy, or long-term economic discretion. Capitalism, by contrast, ties funding to market discipline, investor exit, and structural concessions in your side of the house.